Welcome back. We are moving to the second part of the session on physiological changes due to acute exercise. So, we are going to look at the changes in terms of cardiovascular changes, respiratory changes, and the hormonal changes. So, the first, let us begin with the cardiovascular changes due to acute exercise. So, what is the purpose of the cardiovascular change? It is to cause increase in the cardiac output so that the heart can enhance the delivery of oxygen to the working musculature. By enhancing the pumping capacity of the heart, more blood is delivered to the muscle and thereby delivery of oxygen is promoted. The second role is the increased muscle blood flow. The skeletal muscle blood flow has to increase in order to supply more amount of oxygen. So the blood vessels in the muscle dilate, increasing the local blood flow. It also causes decrease in the blood flow to the splanchnic circulation in the kidneys because to redirect the blood flow to the working muscle. We all know that we have 5 to 6 liters of blood in our body. The same 5 to 6 liters is being pumped by the heart as the cardiac output. So in order to increase the skeletal muscle blood flow, we have to divert the blood flow from some other organ. Those organs are the kidney, the liver and the gastrointestinal circulation. So by diverting the blood flow from these organs to the muscle, the cardiac output is increased. So this slide shows you the summary of the cardiovascular changes due to light to moderate intensity exercise. So the first one we are looking at is the cardiac output, which is represented by the letter Q. So the cardiac output increases with the intensity of the exercise or the duration of the exercise. So and it reaches the plateau as a steady state as we reach the steady state. The stroke volume also increases and it reaches the steady state after some time. The heart rate also increases. Both stroke volume and the heart rate increase can lead to increase in the cardiac output. The blood pressure, namely the systolic blood pressure, increases to a certain extent. It depends on the intensity of the exercise, whereas the diastolic blood pressure in light to moderate exercise remains the same. The total peripheral resistance decreases during exercise. Because of the drop in the total peripheral resistance, more blood reaches the muscle. The rate pressure product is an indicator of the myocardial workload that also increases during acute exercise. So what happens to the cardiovascular system on a long term exercise, or we can call it as endurance training? When we do endurance training, what happens to the cardiovascular adaptations? Whenever we do exercise on a long run, the maximum stroke volume and the maximum cardiac output increases. So when you compare a trained and the untrained individual, the trained individual will be able to generate more amount of cardiac output compared to the untrained. Also, the because of increased pumping action of the heart, so it undergoes hypertrophy, and this is what we call it as cardiac hypertrophy. So endurance athletes on a long term training, we can see the cardiac hypertrophy in those hearts. Also, there is a decrease in the submaximal heart rate that indicates that the person has become more fit. Okay, so his cardiovascular fitness has increased because for the set amount of exercise, his heart rate is increasing to a lesser extent compared to the untrained individual. Also, we can see the increase in the skeletal muscle blood flow because of increased formation of capillaries in the skeletal muscle. And we also see a change in the resting heart rate. It is reduced. So the lower resting heart rate is an indication of the parasympathetic adaptation to long-term exercise. Next, we are looking at the respiratory changes due to acute exercise. The role of the respiratory system during exercise is to maintain the partial pressure of oxygen for the exercising muscle. The muscles are in a great need of oxygen for the aerobic metabolism to run. To supply the oxygen, the respiratory system is very essential. The adequate functioning of the respiratory system is essential. Also, the respiratory system helps in the elimination of the carbon dioxide, which is produced due to metabolism of the skeletal muscle. So, thereby maintaining the PCO2 levels. It also assists in the maintenance of the acid-base balance during intense exercise. So, what are the changes the respiratory system undergo in order to produce all this? Increased tidal volume, increased respiratory rate, both of that will result in increase in the ventilation. Also, the diffusion capacity of oxygen and the carbon dioxide increases. That means the gas moves from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillary. Particularly, the oxygen moves from the alveoli to the pulmonary capillary, and the carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction. Both these diffusion is happening at a higher rate when we do exercise. Also, there is increase in the pulmonary blood flow, so that more amount of blood gets oxygenated. Increase in the oxygen uptake, or we call it as VO2 max, increases, and then increase unloading of oxygen at the tissues because the tissues are in a great demand of oxygen. And there is increased loading of carbon dioxide to the hemoglobin at the tissues because the cells have produced more amount of carbon dioxide due to the prevailing metabolism. So now we are looking at the respiratory changes due to light to moderate intensity exercise. We can appreciate that the ventilation has increased and it has become steady after a steady state of exercise. The tidal volume has increased. We can appreciate that here. And the frequency or the respiratory rate also increases to increase the ventilation. So these are the key changes in the respiratory system due to acute exercise. Now, let us see what happens to the respiratory system on a long-term exercise, or we can see in terms of endurance training. There will be an increase in the maximum ventilation. So, a trained person will be able to ventilate at a higher rate during a maximal exercise. Also, when he is doing a sub-maximal exercise, okay, so his ventilation is reduced because that shows an improvement in the cardiorespiratory fitness of the individual. And there is an increase in the lung capacities like your total lung capacity and the vital capacity, and increase in the respiratory muscle strength. Okay, so the respiratory muscles are also skeletal muscle. So on regular exercise, these muscles also undergo an increase in the strength. Increase in the lactate threshold. So in the previous part of the lecture, we saw what is lactate threshold. I told you when you build up the lactate at a later point of time, so that is an advantage to you. So, increase in the lactate threshold happens due to adaptation in the respiratory system. Also, there is an increase in the VO2 max, or the maximum volume of oxygen we can consume. So, now let us look at the hormonal changes due to acute exercise. So, only the key hormones I have represented here. So, the growth hormone shows an increase, and the role of growth hormone during exercise is to increase the protein synthesis in the muscle, and it causes increased gluconeogenesis, that means formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, and it also mobilizes the fat from the adipose tissue so that it acts as a glycogen sparing agent. That means it preserves the glucose, it acts as the glucose preserving agent. It maintains the plasma blood glucose level for the functioning of the brain. The next is antidiuretic hormone, which is secreted by the hypothalamus, and it is stored in the posterior pituitary. It also increases during exercise. It increases during exercise beyond 30 minutes of duration. It reduces the water loss from the body to maintain the plasma volume. Basically, it reduces the amount of urine and therefore preserves the water in the body, and it is trying to compensate the water loss through sweat. The epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is produced from the adrenal medulla, also increases during exercise, and this causes an increase in the heart rate, and also it mimics the action of growth hormone in mobilizing fatty acid and using fat as the source of fuel. The aldosterone, which is secreted from the adrenal cortex, is involved in the sodium balance, and it also increases during exercise. The cortisol, again, which is secreted by the adrenal cortex, the main role of cortisol is anti-inflammatory action. The testosterone is one of the key hormone which increases during exercise, particularly resistance training. It causes muscle protein synthesis and it is responsible for the muscle hypertrophy. Insulin is the only hormone which reduces during exercise, and the key action of insulin is plasma glucose lowering action. But due to the sympathetic stimulation during exercise, the insulin levels usually reduces during any form of exercise. So now we are looking at the graphical representation of the hormonal changes. So what we can witness here is the increase in the growth hormone with different intensities of exercise. Beyond a light intensity, it increases to a greater extent. The same way we can witness the changes in the epinephrine and the norepinephrine levels. So that also increases with the duration of exercise. The plasma ADH or the antidiuretic hormone, as I told you, increases beyond 30 to 40 minutes of exercise, and it is involved in the maintenance of the water balance. The plasma insulin is the only hormone which reduces during exercise, as we can witness in the graph. So these are the references of this presentation. You can go through this textbook to get further knowledge about this topic. To summarize what we have seen so far, we have discussed the various energy system which is involved in the skeletal muscle contraction, and in the second part of the video we have discussed the various physiological changes due to acute exercise. Thank you.